Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to begin our afternoon program. We will start with a discussion on the future of emerging tech and national security. Please join Ann Neuberger, Deputy Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Tech, joined by David Sanger, White House and National Security Correspondent for the New York Times.
Well, good afternoon. I hope everybody's settled in after grabbing some lunch from this great session. I wish Ash Carter could be here. I was listening to the last discussion. Ash, who was somebody who I knew for 30 years or so, I thought how much he would have really enjoyed this. I'm delighted to be with Ann Neuberger today. I'm David Sanger from the New York Times. And Ann is the Deputy National Security Advisor for Cyber and Emerging Technologies. And we're going to talk about both today. Ann, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
It's great to be here. And I share with you very much the sense that Ash's vision and essence is here with us as we talk about tech and national security and this urging of us to move faster and further as quickly as possible.
I think that's right. Let me start, Ann, with a line from the last panel. Eric Schmidt, during this really interesting discussion that he was having with David Cohn and General Milley and Alex Karp, said, deterrence is not only showing that you can be strong, it is demonstrating that you can avoid being turned off. And that's the most likely scenario in coming years. It's an interesting way to think about it because what Eric was talking about was essentially what we think of as deterrence by denial, basically telling your adversary that there is no way that they can actually blind you. As you and I have talked about before in other forums, that's exactly the concern we have in a future conflict with China. It's the essence of the problem of Volt Typhoon, the placement of malware inside American infrastructure, which David Cohen talked about a little bit in the last session. So tell us a little bit about what you're thinking in your office these days, and as you talk to the military and the IC about questions of deterrence, what kind of progress we've made in the cyber realm and beyond, how you're doing in getting out of the problem of Volt Typhoon.
So Volt Typhoon is really a great example. Volt Typhoon essentially Chinese military pre-positioning in military systems, in critical systems from water to power to pipelines in the United States and our key Indo-Pacific allies. And we do think, David, as you noted, that the Chinese strategy is to use that pre-positioning to either disrupt or break those systems during a time of conflict or crisis, either for a very practical reason, to prevent a deployment of military forces, or to put pressure to convey to the American homeland, do you really want to get involved in a potential crisis or conflict half a world away? And so I think that is something that we expect we would see in that kind of crisis. Either we, Indo-Pacific allies, seeing communications disrupted, seeing power, for example, to a military base disrupted, seeing potentially water systems overflowing in a physical sense. So the question is, how does one deter that? And we've had three focused ways. The first is make them a harder target. Too many critical systems in this country are vulnerable. So we've really deepened our focus. President Biden has put in place the first minimum mandates for critical sectors, and we've built very focused, purpose-built alliances with key Indo-Pacific allies, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, looking at critical infrastructure through the lens of national security, sharing intelligence and partnering on securing, monitoring those systems, and frankly, building the policy framework in both the United States and those countries to really look at what one might have thought of as a water system as merely a water system, but a water system as a tool both of an adversary seeking to deter us and improving the security of that as a way we could deter as well. The second key piece of that is, of course, building our own capabilities and messaging that a disruption of digital systems will be viewed much the same as any other attack on the homeland and will be dealt with accordingly via a combination of both traditional cyber capabilities and all uses of power that we have.
So let me dig down on two parts of that. So first, Volt Typhoon, the placement of malware in these systems is not a new problem for you. It's not even exclusively a China problem. You've been very public, and the government was very public in past administrations about this problem with Russia as well. How confident are you that you even have your arms around the scope of the issue, that you know what kind of malware is there, that you're able to either eradicate or neutralize it? So obviously, you've been at this for a few years now, so you're way up the learning curve.
The Chinese approach is notably different from the approach you're referencing, which is the Russian approach in our power grid 5-10 years ago. So the Russian approach indeed was gain access, build exquisite malware, leave it there to be activated at a time of need, or potentially to collect intelligence throughout. The Chinese approach has really been get to know a system well, get to know the commands of the system. Think about in our own lives, just deleting a drive, formatting a disk, those basic commands that essentially disable a system. The Chinese maintain access, the knowledge of the system, and the ability to then do that at a moment in time of their choosing. So what does this mean? It means that when we put cyber defenders, and we have done so, put some of our best cyber defenders to hunt on ally systems, on our own systems, we used to think we had to look for malware, and we didn't find it. And then we saw that it wasn't the malware, it was the tradecraft. It's maintaining the access to the system. It's understanding the commands and capabilities of the system and then building a plan to be activated. So it's required a much more sophisticated approach for us, but it's also underscored why good practices, not using passwords, using multi-factor, encrypting across the network, segmenting the network. So if an adversary gets on, they can't move freely across, why those practices really are a strong form of deterrence.
So the second and last question for you on this before we turn to some AI applications is this. The presidents raised this issue with Xi Jinping in their Riverside meeting. I suspect he's probably raised it in other conversations they've had. You're about to enter, as I was writing in a story today, a new negotiation on AI, the first conversations between the U.S. And China that requires a little bit of trust with each other on that you can, have an honest conversation on these topics. What do they tell you? And what do you tell them on this way of seeking to undercut each other's power? Because they're assuming, I'm sure, that we're doing the same to them.
Yes, and one key part of the discussion is to say that a presence in each other's critical infrastructure is fundamentally destabilizing. And within a relationship that we're seeking to add stability, that we're seeking to have, while we are in a strategic competition, we want to ensure that we maintain channels of communication on things that could bring real risk to that relationship. So the purpose of this conversation is to convey that disruptions, presence, pre-positioning in critical infrastructure is fundamentally destabilizing, and that we are actively hunting for it. We're actively improving our own digital infrastructure, and all that is being done to ensure that they should feel confident those capabilities will not be available to them at a time of crisis or conflict, because we are focused on doing everything we can to remove them from our infrastructure, because we think the stability of infrastructure is so core to.
And from your history at the NSA, both on the cybersecurity side of this and on the offensive side, how could we assure the Chinese that we wouldn't go off and do fundamentally the same? Because they're going to see very little incentive to stop this activity unless they believe there were mutual commitments here. And it's an area that has always sort of defied international understandings.
One key component of us is both of us have very digitally connected societies. We each can cause significant harm. None of us wants to be in an escalatory cycle of offensive cyber capabilities. And I think that's a big part of the conversation as well.
So let's turn to AI for a moment. You spent a lot of time thinking about how artificial intelligence will affect the IC, the intelligence community, from which you spent much of your career. This is obviously a topic that people are spending days thinking of, at their days thinking of at CIA, at DIA, satellite systems, NGA, and so forth. What are your big conclusions about what we should be focused on as we enter the AI era and think about how it can affect both collection and defense?
So AI has tremendous promise for the intelligence community and also brings a great deal of risk. And that tremendous promise comes in a number of ways. So to your point, think about the current way that we gather, analyze, and generate intelligence. That's done in a very sequential process. We will have, and we are having, 1,000-fold increase in imagery that we will be collecting now over the next 5 years. We already collect more SIGINT than we can possibly process. So when we think about the role of AI in triaging what we collect and gathering together across the different INTs, and in accelerating whether it's indications and warning or reporting. So here's an example. So think about today, as we look at intelligence, there's multiple kinds of intelligence, indications and warning. Is there something developing that's anomalous that somebody needs to be concerned about? For example, a ship that we know runs sanctions for the North Koreans, and we see that ship approaching a key area where we think the North Koreans are buying arms or selling arms. Indication and warning, because if we want to do something about it, that's time-sensitive intelligence. Similarly, think about a crowd forming around an embassy in a country where we have difficult relations. Is that a crowd just gathering for routine, or are there people in the crowd who we know are of concern? Are there conversations happening in the crowd that tell us that they're coming together to potentially storm the embassy, cause some harm? All of that requires pulling together imagery, voice, and knowledge of the analyst. What's precedent? What's an anomaly? What have we learned from the past in a rapid and effective way? Today, much of that within each of the different agencies who process that signals, that intelligence, much of that is still done manually, certainly integration across that intelligence. So the opportunity for AI to collapse the steps. For example, you have some commercial imagery firms who are taking it all the way from collection to computer vision models to then identify that North Korean ship. We've seen that ship before. We see where it's coming from. We're potentially collecting on the sailors on the ship. We know what's planned. When private sector firms can do that, can we get to the point where we're buying the analytics at the end to help inform rapid I&W? On the analytics side, the intelligence community generates thousands of reports annually. Today, if I, as a policymaker or an analyst who studies, the GRU, the SVR, wants to know, summarize everything about this particular unit, particular operations, they'll run a query and they'll get back as many reports as there are on that query within SIGINT, within UMINT, etc. And then they'll have to read them and summarize them. But think about a ChatGPT-like capability on existing reporting that can summarize the existing reporting on a topic quickly to help either an analyst think about that further or to help a policymaker get rapid access and frankly free up our analysts to do what they love to do best, which is generate new insights, new, more advanced insights. So those are kind of two examples in the intelligence community. On the third piece I talked about, which is the peril, we're not the only ones using large language models. We're not the only ones training off intelligence reporting. And the key question is the pattern recognition component of AI. Can that potentially identify our covert communications, our covert operations? And how do we think about using AI to red team ourselves so we're a step ahead on the defense of potentially being exposed because adversaries are, for example, collecting imagery around the world, people who they may be suspicious about, running those models and looking back over time to see where has this person been, where has this anomalous waveform of communications been. So in summary, there's a lot there and there are excellent efforts happening across the IC, but it can be transformative and it must be transformative for the IC on both the promise and on managing for the risks in the next few years.
One characteristic of the Biden administration's approach to this has been to try to buy us a little bit of advantage time here. That's what the export controls against sending the highest performance chips to China are. It's behind the controls on ASML machines, the lithography machines that would sit at the middle of a fab, particularly for 3 nanometer and below architectures. It's what's behind building up capacity to produce these chips at home. Same thing for limiting the sales of large language models, so forth. How much time do you think you have bought? I mean, if you're in this cat and mouse game where you assume the Chinese are doing exactly what you just described, or the Russians are, but particularly China since it's putting the most resources into it. I've heard some of your colleagues say, I think we can maintain like a 10-year buffer. I've heard people in Silicon Valley say, I think we'd be lucky to maintain an 18-month buffer. Where are you?
So I think first, the way to look at advancements in AI is certainly the chips, but it's really the chips, the compute, and the models, because they all come together.
The whole stack.
Yes. And one of the reasons is, we've put such a focus on competing more effectively in 5G is because that telecommunications presence gives access to the data. That cloud presence gives access to the data. And I think as we look at, for example, China's presence around the world, the opportunity to train systems on facial recognition of service members deployed around the world, on particular kinds of components country by country. So thinking about how we compete really needs to integrate across telecom, cloud, that data present, as well as the models, and then of course the chips that are driving all of that. To your question, I'm probably thinking we're on the lower side, but the key for us is that we always maintain a leading edge and that we're also constantly using AI for defense to really think through how does this next generation model potentially help an adversary accelerate the development of cyber weapons, bioweapon, disinformation, and how can we use AI to help build defenses? And I think one way to think about it is the way we would traditionally think about submarine, counter-submarine, missile and counter-missile, missile defense, where it was never static. We were always on the lookout to see, okay, what is the next generation of Soviet then at that time? Submarine detection systems. What do we think we can do with regard to our submarine detection systems? And then how do we ensure we build that into our own submarines? So we're constantly one step ahead and working to keep that window then as long as we can.
And is that feedback loop working the way you want it to yet in the IC, in the Pentagon? So it strikes me that it's pretty well understood for submarine warfare. You had a fairly narrow spectrum. You were worried about suppressing sound on your end and picking up signal on the other end. Here, the breadth is so great that it's got to be a much harder thing to just keep people ahead.
It's a much harder thing. And there's also a key difference. which is the role of the private sector. The private sector is the driver of American innovation. It's also where a lot of these key capabilities are. So it demands a new kind of partnership in terms of, first, the example, the work Commerce is planning to do on the AI Safety Center, and the national security component of that, which is constantly testing those models, thinking about what is adequate red teaming of those models before they can be used. What are ways that an adversary can intentionally train a model that we may then work to use in our national security system to give it incomplete or inaccurate out? So
Yep.
there's a lot that we need to do differently because of the active role the private sector.
And is that what you plan to do within the AI Safety Center, or you're going to do that elsewhere? I mean, AI Safety Center is right now located at NIST. It's not, living in the midst of the classified world.
So there are already efforts happening in the intelligence community, taking a look at and testing these models. The AI Safety Center, to take a step back, there are many risks, as the president's executive order talked about. There's the societal risks of promoting bias, promoting disinformation. And then there are the national security risks we talked about a moment ago. So certainly the AI Safety Center will have a national security seat, and that's extensive work that's happening in the intelligence community that will feed into that work so we get a common picture of what the risks are and work with the private sector with one voice on tackling those together.
Turn to the lessons of the Ukraine war. I would say Ukraine has been almost a crystalline experimental center for us. In the last panel, they were talking about the fact that, had we had at the beginning of the war the kind of drone tank killers that we've seen today, that 40-mile line of tanks coming into north of Kyiv never would have happened. You would have hit them before they crossed the line. So there's been an incredibly rapid development. But I also get the sense that rapid development has benefited the Russians as much, if not more, than it's benefited us in recent times. They didn't come to the war using their best electronic warfare capability. They didn't come to the war capable of taking down our HIMARS by turning off GPS or interfering with it. What have you learned from watching the Russians in the past 9 months or a year?
So as you say, Ukraine is a no man's land for electronic warfare. In our 20 years of the counterterrorism fight, this electronic warfare wasn't necessarily something we thought about. And I think as we look at more digitally connected system, the digitally connected battle space, the point you made earlier about deterrence is turning off systems, the power of EW and moving, today, we exercise a couple of times a year. We update our defensive systems and our offensive systems on a pretty long time frame. Where we need to get to is continuously evolving and really shutting down or tightening from where you see a new signal to where you've delivered a way to defend against that or offensively handle that and then deploy that to the platform in a matter of hours, in a matter of minutes. And that circle is something new. And frankly, it's one of the reasons that the White House has put such a focus on the national spectrum strategy, to say that spectrum communications underpins our economy, whether it's connected industries, connected cars, UAVs that are used to monitor large-scale infrastructure, to detect, for example, down lines. We're using that in a Ukraine context, following Russian strikes to determine where are the key places to repair electricity lines in order to bring back power as quickly as possible. So communications and connectivity are really key to many connected industries. They're also key to the military. And I think just to get to a place where we have visibility in the electromagnetic battlefield of all systems, so we don't jam ourselves, so we see everything that we're doing and can adapt quickly, that's going to be key. We're learning it in the Ukraine context. It'll be absolutely critical in a potential China crisis because the Chinese really have sophisticated capabilities in integrating satellite, EW, and cyber in a much more rapid way.
It is interesting you say, we test this train a couple times a year. In the commercial world, I mean, your iPhone updates so many times, probably drives you crazy. Certainly does mine, right? With the new version every seems like every week or two, and you're into a forced update. Why has it been so difficult to move to that model?
It's an interesting question. I think the introduction of software-defined waveforms on radios, software layers on military systems has really changed what was traditionally a longer term upgrade to systems. And now that systems have a core software component, we have the ability to update them continuously. But thinking about the electromagnetic battlefield in that kind of dynamic way, that signals will constantly change because software allows them to. And on the defense side, we have to be able to detect and deter that. And on the offense side, there's tremendous opportunity to take advantage of. Is I think something that the Ukraine war has taught us, that the community is working to learn those lessons quickly.
Um, Turn briefly, because we only have 2 minutes left, to quantum. This is, on the one hand, an area of great promise for us. But as you and others have warned over the years, a vital threat to our encryption capability. One of the missions of the NSA, where you once resided before moving to the White House. So tell us a little bit about quantum, basically quantum resistant kind of encryption. What kind of progress do you think we made, where we need to go?
So first, time back to our prior conversation, there's really been some interesting breakthroughs in the quantum sensing area as we see more and more GPS denial, thinking about using quantum sensing as an alternate form of PNT, position, navigation, and timing, in areas which are GPS denied. So for those who've said, where are we with quantum? Is there anything that's real world? That's increasingly real world.
Mm-hmm.
To your point about potential quantum computer and an adversary having that, a cryptographically relevant quantum computer that can break the kind of the digital lock bar that we see when we browse online, asymmetric cryptography, one of the two core kinds of cryptography. That's a nuclear weapon for cybersecurity, whether it's the encryption that protects our national secrets and our intelligence community, or whether it's the communication that protects when we log on to our bank account. The approach to that is a generation of post-quantum, new cryptography. The National Institute for Standards will be releasing 3 standards this summer, and that will be a real key step for us to move globally to this new generation of cryptography. The last time we tried it, it took over 10 years. It's an incredibly fraught move, and the race we're in is, can we do that, particularly for our national secrets, where data that encrypted even 5 years ago can still be valuable to an adversary 10 years from now? Can we be one step ahead in locking down our systems and moving to this new generation of cryptography before an adversary has a cryptographically relevant quantum computer? And we are determined to do that and really work with the key companies who maintain our digital infrastructure, because we need to do that together with partners around the world.
Well, Anne, we could continue this conversation for hours on end, and you and I have been known to do that. But while we're not out of topic, we are, I see, out of time. So I want to thank you very much for this enlightening conversation. Look forward to more, and look forward to our next speakers. Thank you.
And a tribute to Ash again.